So in this Tech Talk, we're going to go through and discuss the idea of implementing threat defense technologies, some of the things that we're looking to do to be able to mitigate some of the security threats that we have on our network. And so obviously we mentioned, if you were here earlier this morning, we mentioned that security is really kind of an in-depth thing. We're looking for not only perimeter security to protect us from the internet, but we're looking at security as traffic goes across the WAN, or if it goes across a public internet, right, from a small office or a home office that we might use, or even a branch office as well. You might see the idea that you've got a WAN connection, but to back that up, they got an internet connection that we might potentially do things like a VPN tunnel through. We're going to be looking at the idea of how do we secure things like wireless access points with some type of key that we use for encryption back and forth between the device and the actual wireless access point as well. Right, so when we deal with the idea of security, they talk about the idea of the tenets of security. We've got data integrity, data confidentiality, and they show availability. I would also say the idea of data authentication. Right? So the confidentiality piece is to make sure that as traffic goes across a public network, that we have some way of being able to encrypt that so that it can't be read by just anybody on that public network. We have data authentication to make sure that I'm actually receiving it from the right host as it comes inbound. And last but not least, we have data integrity. And our integrity check is to make sure that as traffic goes through that VPN tunnel, that no one changes the contents of that packet. Right? So we're looking for the idea of how do we actually make sure that that actually occurs. And they show some things. Obviously, whenever we deal with security, I always think of the idea that knowledge is king. Right? The idea of being able to say, hey, the more I know about what might be potentially out there, the better off I can try and secure that network. Security threats are changing all the time, so we need to make sure that we are aware of what goes on. And they showed some things that we could potentially do within here. They mentioned moderation is desirable. We want to increase awareness by going to lectures, looking at videos, maybe jumping on forums that we might have, posting to different news articles or newsletters that we have out there, bulletin boards for security that we look for. We want to get things like awards for good security, right? So look for companies that support the idea of going through these different processes to make sure that we do have good security. And they show reminders such as login banners, mouse pads, coffee cups, and notepads that we look for, making sure that we've got some way to deal with the idea of not only what our username and password is, right? I don't want people actually putting that information underneath the mouse pad or underneath that keyboard that we're looking for. I want to make sure that we have some way of being able to go through and say, hey, before you leave, make sure you log off. Okay? You see a lot of times that people are utilizing digital certificates. Government workers see this all the time, right? Where they've got a little card that you have to insert into your laptop for that laptop to actually come on. Now, that typically has information like a digital certificate on that card that allows you to get authentication to the network. Now, if you move away, that card comes out of your laptop and it automatically logs you out of that laptop. The idea being is I don't want to leave my device currently logged in where someone can just walk up and start making changes. And they mentioned things like education and training. Obviously, education and training is going to be a big deal to be able to make sure that you are not only aware of what vulnerabilities might potentially be out there, but how do we mitigate those threats? Right, so we want to be able to go through and train not just our engineers, but all the individual end users of what is our security policy, what are the ramifications of what happens when someone gives their username and password away. Okay? Awareness for things like sensitive portions of our network that we have. We need these users are dealing with a secure portion of the network, and they've got special security policies that they need to be dealing with. Right? We need to make sure that our IT staff has some way of being able to make sure that as they go through and make a change, that doesn't eventually break our security policy. We have quite a few different companies will be out there that will do things like assessments and security assessments over and over and over again to validate that you are still compliant with what your security policy actually is. And again, we're looking for things like some advanced information, some training for all of our different practitioners. I mentioned things like specialized training for senior management that we have. How do we make sure that people are compliant with what our security policy actually is? Some things that we can deal with in here are for security purposes, firewalls. Cisco's got the ASA that they use for their firewall. And firewalls are going to be dealing with a lot of different things. If you really look at it, the configuration looks like it's a massive access list. Now, it is not an access list. What I mean by that is an access list is typically just looking at the contents of the header information that we've got for a packet. And it's either a permit or deny. It does not do any kind of stateful packet inspection itself. Our firewalls are typically stateful. What we're looking for in a firewall is that they've got an unprotected zone like the internet and a protected zone like our inside network. And the idea for the firewall would be a couple different things. First off, as our users from the inside network send traffic out to the internet, what we want to do is to look at what the source and destination IP address are, the source and destination port numbers being used, the TCP flags that might be a part of that header information. And the idea is to say, when that return traffic comes back inbound from the internet, I want to verify that matches something that we sent out to begin with. If it doesn't match the original conversation as it goes outbound, I'm not going to allow it inbound. Likewise, we've also got different devices. I think of the idea that we might have another protected zone out of here, which we would call a demilitarized zone, or a DMZ, where you might have a server sitting out over here. Our web server, our email server, things like that need to be publicly available. And the idea is that we're going to have an access list that says as traffic comes inbound from the internet, they can only get to certain locations on these protected networks that we have available for us. Right? So the idea is that we're trying to deal with not only a stateful inspection to make sure that it's not malicious traffic and that it matches what's going on within TCP flags and source and destination port numbers that are being used back and forth, but only certain access to different applications can go to these servers. And it may not allow the idea of a directly connected information coming inbound to my protected zone where my users are. Right? If that didn't go out to begin with, they just try and send a TCP SYN, I'm going to deny that and throw that away here at the firewall. Okay? So that whole idea of it being that stateful inspection is to validate what's going on and that it matches. And you're seeing firewalls also go through and do things like RI sequence and acknowledgement numbers, incrementing the way they should be based off of the contents of the packet. Right? So we're going through and doing a lot of different things to verify that those TCP and UDP sessions are indeed working the way they should be working through that device. Now, some firewalls can go into layer 7 information and actually look into the HTTP header or the application layer header itself to validate what type of traffic are you actually looking for. Right? Like for instance, I want to allow you to be able to get to my web server, for instance, but if you're looking for things like command.exe or root.exe, I want to look for specific HTTP gets that I want to throw away. Those would match what we consider a security signature. And a lot of times what you're going to see these firewalls actually have an intrusion prevention system built into the firewall itself. And the IPS devices are typically going through and looking to see, is that malicious traffic? So it matched our access list and we're going to allow that traffic inbound, but is it now malicious traffic before I send it out onto a server? Okay. So with my firewalls, I can go through and say, traffic coming inbound, I want to be able to allow users from the internet to get to my web server that we might have out over here. But I might deny things like telnet access or SSH access from the outside. If you're not a part of my own local network, I'm not going to allow you to do certain types of protocols within here. So essentially what you're going to see is that as it comes inbound, we're matching an access list to begin with to say, what are we allowing through? And then as we allow it through, I'm going to look at that conversation to make sure that it matches the way that it should be working. Right? Again, I'm going through and validating source and destination port numbers, source and destination IP addresses, protocol values, flags in the TCP headers. We're looking at things like the sequence and acknowledgement numbers to verify that this is valid data as it goes through. So our IPS is typically inline. If they're not even, they might even be a part of the firewall itself. Right? So the idea being is that it goes through and says, now that we've said from the firewall, I'm allowing this type of traffic, now we're validating the contents of the packet from that IPS appliance. They're typically looking for what we would call a security signature, things that are being looked at that said, hey, with this combination of requests, it matches this particular exploitation on the network. And because it's an exploitation, we don't want to allow it to the inside corporate network. So I can throw that information away and potentially log for that as well. Okay. Now, you might even start seeing things like host-based intrusion prevention systems that we've got available for us. So it's an IPS essentially on the end host. Right? So the idea that can be, hey, even though my firewall and the IPS here says that everything's okay, I want to validate on the individual end user to make sure that that traffic is not malicious data, especially if you've got something like encrypted traffic that goes all the way to this host and it doesn't get decrypted until it gets to that host, like you could potentially see in things like IPv6, where this IPS device wouldn't be able to look at the contents of the packet because it's encrypted at this point. We want to go through and make sure that we have some type of protection against data loss and phishing attacks, and we got a lot of different things that can support this. Cisco's got what they call the Web Security Appliance, and the Web Security Appliance goes through and looks for web traffic. It's monitoring HTTP, HTTPS, FTP traffic, FTPS traffic that we've got to see whether or not we've got violations of that type of traffic coming through. We have the ESA, which is the Email Security Appliance that goes through and monitors information that we see in the different emails. Again, looking for phishing attacks that might potentially be occurring within here. You might also see it blocking things such as viruses and worms, Trojan horses that we might potentially have. So the malware that we're dealing with, there's spyware, there's spam. You think about things like ransomware attacks that we have now. Firepower could be used as well. Firepower goes through and protects against things like phishing attacks that we have on the network. So lots of different things that we look for as far as a defense in depth. Okay, so we're looking at our firewalls on our perimeter, our IPS devices right behind the firewalls. We have access lists on our routers and our switches. And again, maybe even potentially host-based intrusion prevention that we got on the individual host as well. To defend against things like denial of service attacks and distributed denial of service attacks. All sorts of different things that you can use to mitigate some of these potential security problems we have on the network. They show some of the things we look for: stateful devices such as firewalls and IPSs, trying to make sure that we're not seeing, I need to allow HTTP traffic inbound, right? But I shouldn't be seeing 10 gigs of HTTP traffic. So I might go through and utilize things like policing within quality of service to limit how much of that type of traffic comes through, right? You could do what they call microflow policing, right? Where we limit the amount of bandwidth on a per conversation basis going to the server itself. You might see things like route filtering techniques with an access list that we're utilizing. Unicast reverse path forwarding is looking at the source IP address of the packet. And what we're trying to do is to say, let's mitigate someone spoofing a source IP address. So with unicast reverse path forwarding, what we're going to do is to check our routing table. Do we have a route to get back to that destination address based off the source IP address of the packet? And would I go out the same interface on where we receive that packet coming inbound? Okay. So I can go through and validate that it is indeed a network that I know about and it's coming from the right direction that it should be coming from. We have geographic dispersion that we look for global resources. So we want to make sure that if somebody goes through and attacks one of our sites, we got another site available that still has that same content. We've got things like tightening connection limits and timeouts that we have available for us, how long it takes to do a three-way handshake. We might go through and say, if it goes idle for a certain amount of time, I'm no longer going to allow that traffic inbound through my firewall. So I time out that connection in our state table, and they've got to restart the communication. We might be looking for things like repudiation-based attacks or blocking that we're dealing with. The idea within repudiation is to say, not only do I know that it was you, but I also know that it was coming from your location as well, okay? So a lot of things that we're looking for with repudiation would be things, think of banks. I log into my bank account and I go through and I write a check to somebody for $1,000. The idea of repudiation would be the concept that I went through and said, hey, I didn't do that. That wasn't my transaction. You need to restore that $1,000 into my account. They need some way at the bank to validate, was that actually me or somebody else that tried to do that access control? We mentioned things like access control lists. We have denial of service run blocks and books that we utilize. There's also manual responses to these attacks, blocking source and destination IP addresses, all sorts of different things that we could potentially do to be able to defend against different attacks. You see people go through and utilize things like network-based application recognition, right? Maybe my IPS, it hasn't been updated, or there isn't even a new update for the new security signatures that we got for a certain attack that just came out. Right, so we can utilize what they call network-based application recognition to create what they call a customized protocol. I want to match things like Code Red or the Slammer virus, and I can say, here's what they're looking for, and let's drop that traffic. Okay. Police it to 0K. We want to make sure that we have some way of being able to validate that nobody has changed the contents of that packet. So we use a hashing algorithm. What the hashing algorithm typically does in this case is they show an arbitrary length of data that we're dealing with, and it's usually based off the checksum of this data, along with a key value, and they run it through a mathematical algorithm, SHA or MD5 that we use. And what happens is they come up with a fixed length hash value. Okay? This whole mathematical algorithm goes through, and I always kind of think of hashing as kind of like a meat grinder. Right? You take a nice juicy steak and you put it through a meat grinder, you got ground beef. You can't go backwards in the opposite direction. It's a one-way function that we see within here. And so the idea is, I take my checksum and a key value, and I come up with a hash. And this hash then gets sent along with that packet. On the other end, they say, I know what kind of traffic I got from you, so I can take a checksum from the packet that you got, along with the same key value, and run it through my own hashing algorithm. And I'll come up with my own hash, and I'll validate, do those two hash values match? And if they do, well then we've got the same amount of data and the same key value that then represents that nobody's made any changes to that data at that point, what we would call an integrity check. Now, hashing is also used when we start dealing with things like authentication. I want to make sure that my password isn't sent across a public network where somebody could read that password. So I can take my password along with a key value and hash that value. Okay? And I use this for authentication. On the other end, I know what your password should be, and I know what key value I sent to you. I come up with my own hash to validate authentication back and forth between the two. Okay? So you'll see with these hashing algorithms, we have what they call Message Digest 5, and SHA is secure hashing algorithm. And again, each one of them kind of comes up with a different length of a hash. MD5 by default comes up with a 128-bit hash length that we have available for us. SHA can be 128 bits, it can be 160 bits, 192 bits, 256 bits, and anymore you can get up to 512-bit hash that we're looking for. A lot of times what you're seeing is that these are going to be considered almost a digital certificate. Okay? Cisco uses them a lot within things like our iOS. Right? So we've got information when they built the actual device itself, they've gone through and given it a certificate authority server and its own certificate of that device. When you download a new iOS, what it's doing is it's got in that operating system another digital certificate. And I'm validating, is the digital certificate of the operating system signed by the same certificate authority as server that we've got as far as the digital certificate of my local machine? Right? That means that it actually came from Cisco and it's real Cisco iOS. If I don't see that hash information within there, I'm going to say this isn't valid Cisco operating system and throw it away. Right? And not allowed to be loaded up on the device. We also look for things like encryption. Encryption allows us to take plain text traffic that we have, go through an encryption algorithm with an encryption key that we use, and this is the key that goes through and does that encryption for us, and come up with what we call ciphertext. On the other end then, they can go through and decrypt that ciphertext and come back up with clear text or plain text traffic, so we can read it on the opposite end. And there are many different types of encryption algorithms. We have data encryption standard and triple data encryption standard. There's advanced encryption standard. There's RSA encryption that we have. There's DSA encryption. So there's a lot of different encryption algorithms you have. And they all work slightly different. You're going to see one of them is what they call a symmetric key algorithm. And with a symmetric key algorithm, typically what we've got back and forth between these two endpoints is an exchange. We use what they call Diffie-Hellman quite often. to go through and exchange a shared key, a secret key that we use. And the idea is this key value is never actually sent across the wire. Right? The way Diffie-Hellman works, it obscures that information so that we can come up with the same key on both sides without ever sending that key value across the individual link. The idea being is that when I take my traffic out over here, my clear text information, I encrypt using that key, I've got ciphertext. On the other end, they use the exact same key value to decrypt that traffic to eventually come up with that plain text traffic again. I kind of equate it to the idea of, you guys remember when you were little kids getting a little box of cereal where you might have a decoder ring in there? In my opinion, it's a perfect example of a symmetric key algorithm. I take a note that's written in English, and I encrypt that using that key, that little decoder ring that they've got, okay? Eventually, then what we've got, I've got that ciphertext. If I give you that ciphertext message along with the decoder ring, you can decode that information and come up with clear text and read what we've got for that note. Okay? It is the exact same key for both encryption and decryption. Versus an asymmetric key algorithm that you might potentially use. Typically, asymmetric key algorithms utilize multiple keys. Both ends come up with what they call a private key. And I'm going to call this one private key number 1. And from that private key, they come up with a derivative known as a public key. Public key number 1. The opposite user comes up with their own private key. We'll call this private key number 2, and a derivative of that known as the public key number 2. As we then connect between the two hosts, what we do is we share these public keys. I give you my public key, and you give me your public key. So now what I've got is I've got public key number 2 out over here, and they've got public key number 1 on this side. As I send data out onto you, I'm going to encrypt that traffic with your public key, the opposite end's public key. And once I encrypted that public key, it can only be decrypted by the private key on the other end. Okay? It's almost kind of like, think of a treasure map, right? We have a map that tells us exactly how to get there and where to go through and get to a specific spot where we got to dig for the treasure, okay? Well, you and I don't have the time to be able to go and get that treasure right now. So what do? Well, we tear that treasure map in half. You take one half, I take the other half. So you know how to get to the location, but you don't know exactly where that treasure is buried. I know exactly how that treasure is, where that treasure is buried, but I don't know how to get to the location. We need to have both halves of that information to be able to go and get that treasure. Same kind of idea here, right? As they encrypt in one direction, they use the opposite end's public key, which can only be decrypted by the private key on the other end. Likewise, as I send traffic in the opposite direction, I'm going to go through and encrypt using their public key. Right? So I encrypt using public key number 1, which can only be decrypted by private key number 1 on the opposite end. Okay? You see this quite often when we start dealing with the idea of, it depends on the encryption algorithm that you're using, but you also see it quite often when you deal with things like HTTPS. Okay? The idea is you connect to a server and the server sends you their public key. You encrypt using their public key that can only be decrypted by the server's private key on the opposite end. So we deal with what they call an IPsec VPN tunnel. And whenever you talk about an IPsec, think of IPsec as not a protocol, it's a framework of a bunch of different protocols that we need to deal with, okay? How are we going to secure the information? We have encapsulated security payload. We have authentication header that can give us authentication and an integrity check. We can use them both, right? ESP also has the availability to do encryption of traffic. Right? How are we going to do that encryption? Well, we got different ways of doing encryption. Like we said, we have data encryption standard. And this uses one 56-bit key that we have available for us. And from one side, we encrypt using that key. The other end decrypts using the exact same key value. The problem with it is that 56-bit key, not really all that long, right? So it's something that we could potentially have someone go through and validate what that key value is, and then they can encrypt and decrypt. So what we came up with was then triple DES. Triple DES uses 3 separate 56-bit keys. The idea being, when I encrypt with key number 1, then key number 2, then key number 3. When I decrypt with key number 3, then key number 2, then key number 1. It's like having multiple locked doors that we have to go through to be able to get into somebody's house. Okay. The problem with triple DES, the idea of encryption and decryption 3 different times with 3 different keys, typically tends to high CPU utilization. Right? But we're looking for that longer key value that we're dealing with. So they came up with advanced encryption standard. AES uses a much longer key value. Rather than a 56-bit key, I can use a 128-bit key, a 192-bit key, a 256-bit key. Now we can do up to a 512-bit key that we deal with. And the idea is it's one single key, kind of similar to DES, but because that key value is so much longer, it makes it much more difficult to come up with what that key value actually is. Okay? We have seal. It's another way we could go through and encrypt that traffic. So there's a lot of different options that we have as availability to get that confidentiality piece. How do I encrypt and decrypt? How do I do integrity check, making sure no one changes the contents of that packet? And again, this is typically based off of what they call a hash message authentication code. Right? And we've got Message Digest 5, there's Secure Hashing Algorithm version 1, and then there's also a Secure Hashing Algorithm version 2, which uses longer key values that we have. How do we do authentication on the opposite end? We could have a pre-shared key, a password that both ends know about. We could use things like RSA encryption or authentication. That's Revit, Shamir, and Edelman. There's DSA encryption or authentication that we can use as well. And then how do we go through and make sure that we don't use the same key for too long? Okay? So we have ways of being able to go through and do key management. How do we come up with that shared secret key? We have things like the Diffie-Hellman key exchange that we have available for us. New versions of Diffie-Hellman. There's the Internet Key Exchange in IKE version 2 as well. All of these are different frameworks. When we go through and set up a VPN tunnel, we have to go through and create essentially a policy that says, how are we going to do this? How are we going to encrypt? What kind of things are we going to use for authentication, integrity checks, and encryption? What type of encryption are we going to use? How are we going to validate an integrity check? What kind of authentication are we going to use? And how do we change those keys? All have to be built in what they call a profile, essentially, that we use. Okay? And you're going to see, as IPsec, what they typically do, and this is an example of what we call tunnel mode IPsec. As traffic has to traverse this public network of the internet, I'm going to take a packet. So in this case, they're showing the packet coming from the individual user. And notice they have all the upper layer data right here and their own IP header. Right? This being the source IP address, this being the destination IP address of that internal packet that we're dealing with. Right? And in tunnel mode IPsec, that original packet that we've got out over here is all encrypted. Okay? And notice that they actually show, we even encrypt this, what they call an ESP trailer as well. Okay? That gets encrypted as well. The ESP trailer information allows us to be able to specify when it gets to the other end, how do we do all this decryption information? Okay? We eventually then put on an ESP header on the outside of this link. We put an ESP authentication information, right? So we can go through and validate this password. Notice what's authenticated is the ESP header, and all the encrypted data is all authenticated in a hash value that we're utilizing. And then eventually we put on a transport header that we're dealing with. This is an external IP header. And on this external IP header here, this is the source IP address, and this is the destination address in most cases. The endpoints of the VPN tunnel that we're actually utilizing back and forth. Okay? One of the concepts now being is that as it traverses the internet, they're looking at just this external header here to be able to determine how do I deliver that correctly to the right endpoint. Once it gets to the router on the opposite end, they'll strip off the new IP header as they're showing on this particular packet, that transport header. They'll go through and authenticate information within here. We'll use the ESP header to determine how do we decrypt all this traffic, and then my ESP trailer can go through and do things like my integrity check. Is this internal packet here still the same amount of data? Okay. They can show. So that's tunnel mode, as they show down here on the bottom. There is also transport mode. And in transport mode, the big difference is I'm not encrypting the entire internal packet. I'm encrypting from the TCP header up to the application layer and the actual physical data that we've got. That gets encrypted. I put on an ESP header, and then I eventually put on an ESP authentication. And the original IP header is reused as the transport header at that point. Okay? So you only see that when the idea would be that with this external header, let me skip back one page. We need to make sure that our end hosts actually have a public IP address, and we can send traffic directly back and forth between the two. Right? So you see things like tunnel mode used a lot more in IPv4, where we're using things like network address translation. And we see transport mode used a lot more in IPv6, where everybody has a global IP address, and we can encrypt and decrypt between the different endpoints. Right? We mentioned earlier that our tunnel is usually from one end to the other end in a site-to-site environment, in this case. In IPv6, because everybody has a public IP address or global address, we can actually have a VPN tunnel that goes from host to host at this point, okay? So we can keep that traffic encrypted even on the local link, okay? It doesn't get decrypted until it actually receives it at this PC at the end host over here. So that's a big difference for us, where we get that host-to-host based encryption. Now, as far as our confidentiality, we said the different encryption algorithms that we have. We said DES uses a symmetric 56-bit key. Encrypt on one side, decrypt with the same key on the other side. Okay? Triple DES is a variant of that. It uses 3 separate 56-bit keys. And again, like we said, we're going to encrypt with the first key, then the second key, then the third key. They decrypt with the third key, then the second key, then the first key. Okay? So it's a lot more work, and you see a lot of CPU processing time to be able to support the idea of triple DES. Okay? AES, or Advanced Encryption Standard, offers different key lengths, as they show. There's 128, 192, 256-bit key, and even more. Now you can do a 512-bit key as well on some devices. Okay? And the idea is it's a much longer key, but it's only going to be one single key, more like what we see within DES. So it gives us better confidentiality of the packet than DES, and better CPU utilization than triple DES. Okay? As a matter of fact, AES is considered to be even better confidentiality than triple DES. We have RSA, Revit Shamir and Edelman, is a company that goes through and uses these asymmetric keys, where we've got public and private key pairs that are going to be back and forth between the two. And they show they commonly use a length of 124-bit key or longer that we have. They show IPsec doesn't use RSA for data encryption. I'm gonna say, with Cisco, that's true, okay? Other devices can't actually deal with that. And then we've also got the stream cipher that uses a 160-bit key with seal for our encryption. Okay. For key management, one of the things that we look for, I don't care how good your encryption algorithm is and how long your key value is. As we go through and send traffic through that VPN tunnel, the more traffic we send through, the idea is that as an attacker in the middle, I can go through and take all that traffic, and even though I can't read it, I can put it into an analyzation tool. And that analyzation tool will go through and analyze all that traffic, finding a pattern in that encryption. So once you send enough data, I find a pattern. That pattern is essentially the key to use for encryption back and forth. Right? So the idea that we want to go through and change that key every so often. We're going to go through and use some kind of key management protocol like Diffie-Hellman or the Internet Key Exchange to go through and say, hey, at a certain amount of time, let's rekey this traffic back and forth between the two. Okay? Now, I know a lot of people don't necessarily know some of the increment or real details of an IPsec tunnel, but really what you're going to see is there are multiple tunnels when you go through and send traffic across an IPsec VPN. Right? You're going to have that we enable one tunnel to begin with, sometimes known as IPsec Phase 1. Right? Cisco sometimes calls this the an IPsec tunnel, the Internet Security Association Key Management Protocol, okay? And the idea with this IPsec Phase 1 is we're using this to, A, authenticate between the two different devices and come up with some encrypted tunnel that we can then go through across this tunnel and do a key exchange, right? So this would be where you've got things like the Diffie-Hellman key exchange or the IPsec key exchange. And the idea of that key exchange is to come up with the encryption keys that we're going to be using for this link between the two hosts, what we call a security association, okay? These essays are stored on both endpoints to not only say, how do we secure this IPsec Phase 1 tunnel, what kind of Diffie-Hellman key exchange are we going to use within here, how do we authenticate vehicle, and how long can this tunnel be used before we have to rekey? Okay, so they have a lifetime of that, and that's stored in what we call our security association database. Now, once we've done this key exchange via Diffie-Hellman, then we bring up another tunnel. As a matter of fact, there are actually two other tunnels. And this is sometimes known as IPsec Phase 2, or an IPsec tunnel. And the IPsec tunnel is where you're actually sending your usable data from user to user. And the reason that there's two tunnels is there's one tunnel used as we send traffic in one direction, and the other tunnel is used as we send traffic in the opposite direction. Okay, so we're seeing that we encrypt and decrypt on different IPsec Phase 2 tunnels that are being used. And again, the idea being is that as we send enough data through these IPsec Phase 2 tunnels, we'll eventually time out the IPsec Phase 1 tunnel. Time to rekey, okay? And what they'll do is they'll drop the IPsec Phase 1 tunnel. While that's dropped, we can still send usable data across the IPsec Phase 2 tunnel. We eventually then renegotiate an IPsec Phase 1 tunnel, do another Diffie-Hellman key exchange or an IP key exchange to say, let's come up with a new shared secret key. Once we've done that, then we drop the old IPsec Phase 2 tunnels, the IPsec tunnels that we have down over here, and start those back up with the new key value. Okay? And we want to do that before we send too much data across this link. The general rule of thumb is we typically look for no more than 4.29 billion bytes of data going across using the exact same key. Right? So the shorter key values, DES for instance, for your encryption, the more often we're going to want to go through and do that rekeying. They show that Internet Key Exchange, or IPsec, is a protocol that goes through and negotiates that security association, what kind of characteristics, how are we going to authenticate, what kind of hashing algorithm we're going to use, how are we going to go through and share that key value back and forth. They generate the key, they automatically refresh those keys, we're going to time out the security association and renegotiate a new key. Okay? And they show it's a manageable manual configuration that we use. And there are two versions of IPsec version 1 and IPsec version 2 that we have available for us. Our data integrity is to make sure that no one changes the contents of that packet. So I'm typically going through and I'm going to take information, right, a packet that we're going to send back and forth, and then checksum of that packet, along with a secret key that we have that's been negotiated between the two endpoints. And I go through my mathematical algorithm to come up with this hash value. On the opposite end, when they receive this packet, they're going to check some of that packet along with this shared key and run their own hashing algorithm and verify, do those two hashes actually match within each other. Okay? It is a one-way process, meaning when you encrypt on one side, decrypt on the other. Right? In hashing, it's one way. I hash. You don't unhash that information. What you do is you take the same information, come up with a hash, and validate that the two hash values are the identical value. For authentication of where it's coming from, making sure I know that not only do no one change the contents of this packet and that it's encrypted so that no one can read it, but that I'm receiving it from the right host. Okay? We've got a couple ways that we could go through and do that authentication. There is a pre-shared key. We get on the phone back and forth between the two and we say, here's what key value we're going to use back and forth. And you both type it in exactly the exact same. Or you get together in person and we write it down so that we know exactly what that key value is supposed to be back and forth. We have things like RSA signatures that can be used, digital certificates to validate that the user is indeed a part of our company. We have RSA encrypted nonces that they use. It's a random number that's generated by our peer. And then they also have DSA signatures as well that uses an electric curve analog signature. It's very similar to like the digital certificate, but this is more of a standardized protocol, if you will. Used a lot in government work. They mentioned things like secure socket layer, transport layer security, used quite often when you start dealing with things like Cisco's VPN client that they've got, the AnyConnect client. Right? What we're going to do is we're going to connect to a device based off of SSL, port 443 that we utilize. You might see this when you start dealing with the idea of a server out on the internet somewhere. Right? It's not even my company, but I want to go to, let's say, I'm going to do some e-commerce with Amazon, for instance. Right? I want to make sure that no one gets information about my username and password. I want to make sure that no one gets information about my credit card number that I'm putting in there. So what we do in this case is I'm going to connect to TCP port 443. The server then sends me back their certificate. And in their certificate, it contains their public key. What we're going to see at that point in time is I can take traffic now and encrypt that traffic with their public key. And it gets sent out onto the server. The server can de-encrypt that traffic with their private key, and that's the only one that can de-encrypt that. The AnyConnect VPN tunnel does use either SSL or TLS, but they can also use a true IPsec tunnel as well. Okay. Again, what we're going to see within here is that it allows us to connect to our firewall, our external router, and secure traffic as it goes from my end host into our public network. Right? They will decrypt that and send unencrypted traffic into our internal resources that we have available for us. And again, one of the things we could do is I could have a key value, a username and password for authentication. I could also use things like a digital certificate that would have what they call a certificate authority server. The idea being is that this ASA would have not only its own digital certificate, but also a digital certificate from the security authority server. The idea being is that it's telling me not only here's your information, but here's who you got it from. Okay? The idea being is that when this user sends me their digital certificate, it contains information of the security authority server that has issued them their digital certificate. And I can validate, did your digital certificate match the same certificate authority server that I got my digital certificate from? Okay, and is that a valid certificate? So what I do is I query the certificate authority server saying, hey, is this a valid certificate? Yes, it is. All right, I accept that for authentication. Now, wireless also uses security, WPA and web encryption that we might have, and WPA2 that we deal with. Right? So if you think about when you join any kind of a wireless access point, you got to know what the SSID is, right? The name of the network that we're trying to deal with, and then there's also an encryption key that we use. And it's because when we send that traffic across these radio waves that we have, radio waves are not unidirectional or directional, right? They're not going directly to the wireless access point. They get sent out everywhere, right? So we want to make sure that as I send out a radio frequency, nobody else can actually read that traffic, and that's what we do that encryption for. Now, with these access points, we have things like a common key. The access point has an SSID on one single key. The idea is that everybody wants to connect to that access point uses the exact same key value. You see this a lot for home use. I've got a wireless access at my house. Everybody has the exact same key. Okay, so I just got to give them a username, an SSID, and a password to be able to join that network so that they can go through and do that encryption. Another thing that we could potentially do, however, is you can go through and utilize single keys or individual keys. And the idea is now each individual user has a completely different key to join the same SSID on that access point. Okay? And the idea is that that way, if one user's key gets compromised, we don't have to change the user keys for everybody else. Okay? I only have to change that one user key at that point in time. So this is kind of what I've got for you guys as far as this section right here for this Like I said, it's part of the CCNA, the new CCNA that they've got outbound, and pretty much all I've got for you, unless you guys have any questions. Are there any questions?